Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Capitol Theatre and what I hope will be a wonderful discussion and conversation about climate change, how it affects us, how it will affect us in the future and future generations in this wonderful country of ours. Tonight I have 4 commissioners from the Climate Commission to answer your questions, tell you about the science, about some of the ramifications, and just be available for you to speak to and to converse with. And we'd like to keep this as very much a conversation. We don't want any political rants, we don't want people making statements if you can help it, but please be assured that you are more than welcome to ask any question that you feel should be asked. And our panel of distinguished members of the Commission will do their best to answer your questions. They'll also give you some information about the effects of climate change, what could be happening, and the vision for the future. I'm John Wolfe. I'm a freelance journalist and radio broadcaster and currently the editor of the New England Country Living magazine. The aim of tonight is to be a conversation and to allow you to voice your opinions. I mean, some of you may have come in here tonight saying this climate change is all a bit of BS. Some of you obviously have much stronger opinions than that, and I'm sure your questions will be answered to the best of the ability of our commissioners, and they are experts in their fields and nice, friendly people. I've had lunch with them today and we've had some conversations backstage, so don't be afraid to talk to them. So I will introduce them very shortly, or our chairman will. So I might take this chance to introduce the Chief Climate Commissioner. How's that for a title? And that is Professor Tim Flannery. He's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. Professor Flannery has held various academic positions, including Professor at the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum and Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University, and I've got to get this right, in the Department of Organismic, nope, I got it wrong, didn't I? Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Please welcome Professor Tim Flannery.
Thanks very much, John, and it's tremendous to be here in Tamworth this evening, and thank you all for coming. I know people's time is precious, and I'm surprised that there's so many of you because we didn't promise any country music or boot scooting or anything like that. I think it'd be pretty terrible if we struck up, but we do have a lot of expertise here in terms of this very big issue that's confronting not just Australians but the world in terms of climate change. I'd like to just explain to you briefly how the Climate Commission came into existence and what we do. We are the result of a promise by the Gillard government at the last election to set up a Climate Commission whose job it is to engage with the Australian public in a dialogue about all aspects of climate change. And it is a genuine dialogue, and we find that we learn as we go along, and we hope others learn as well. We are independent of government, so even though we're funded by the government and we were set up by the government, we're an independent commission, and I really value that because my independence is tremendously important to me, independence from the political process. I've criticised the Howard government for things I didn't think were right in the environment space, and I've criticised the Rudd government likewise, and so to me that's my lifeblood, and our independence I think is important to our audience too, because what you can be assured of, if we're truly independent, is that you won't hear any spin from what we tell you. We try to present the facts as understood by the scientific community and understood by our economists and industry leaders to the best of their ability as well. We won't comment on government policy or opposition policy, so we give up the power to do that, really to gain the authority to speak in a way that we feel is fearless without fear or favour. Events like this evening are really the culmination of a visit for us. We tend to go to a region, we might have a breakfast with some community leaders or business leaders, we might then go to a leading business in the area, and today we went to Grain Products Australia here in in Tamworth and had a great meeting with that particular business. We might go to a high school, and we were at Tamworth High School this morning, which was fantastic, and then we may have another meeting with perhaps a one-on-one or some other meetings with people who are important to the community. So by the time we've finished that process, we've learned a lot about communities, about their concerns in the face of climate change, and we've engaged with the local community at all levels, really, and I think that's an important thing to do. The objective of our work really is just to increase the quality of debate around these key issues concerning climate change. We do that because we know that this climate issue is going to be with us for many decades to come. The science is telling us that it's going to take a long time to reduce our emissions and to overcome these problems. 4 decades from now, we'll be discussing the climate challenge, I believe, every bit as we are today, and we'll only be successful in rising to that challenge if we have a well-informed public who understand the issues and can make the appropriate decisions. And it's true in a democracy like Australia. We can't do what's needed to be done without the public agreeing that the issue needs to be dealt with. So that's us. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you. But before we do, I just want to turn to Professor Will Steffen to introduce the first report that the Climate Commission produced. It's a report on the science of climate change. It's called The Critical Decade, and it really frames a lot of what we do and frames why we do things the way we do. So I know that it's taking time away from your precious moments to ask your questions, but if you'll bear with us just for 5 or 10 minutes, we'll go through this presentation because it may actually answer some of the questions that you have in any case. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Will, the author of The Critical Decade.
Thanks very much, Tim, and this will actually be a tag team event because I'll pass off to my colleague Leslie Hughes, who will pass the baton back to Tim right at the end. But we will try to make this brief. As I go around, I get asked 2 questions almost all the time, so I thought we'd start with those. One is, well, is the climate really changing and how do we know? And the second is, if it is changing, why is it changing? Is it something unusual or is it natural variability? So let me show you what the science actually says about this. So we'll start with the aspect of climate that most of us are most interested in, which is air temperature. The temperature at the surface of the Earth that we experience from day to day, from year to year, and from decade to decade. You can see the record there, which starts at 1880, and it goes to 2010, last year. And you can see a lot of change from year to year. Not every year is warmer than the one before it, because there's a lot of variability. You even see 5 or 10-year periods, which nothing seems to happen. But the longer-term trend, particularly since about 1950, is absolutely clear. The Earth is warming. And the temperature differential there around the globe is just a little under 1 degree Celsius over that period from 1950 to the present. And if you go decade by decade, the last decade that ended in 2010 was the warmest on record, considerably warmer than the one before it, which is warmer than the one before it. We normally take at least 30 years to really determine a trend. That's the air. But if we were marine mammals, we would be interested in the ocean. So if we go to the ocean, that's what the ocean temperature looks like. For a scientist, this is actually more important because the ocean stores a lot more heat than the air does. So if we really want a signal of a change in climate, here's where we go. Now you see the record there from 1950, again to 2010. And again, from about the middle of last century, from about 1965 or 70, you start to see this moving upwards. And again, the warming has continued right through to the present time. But we can look at other parts of the Earth's system too, and that is something like ice. Well, if the world is warming, ice should be decreasing, and indeed it is. This is the sea ice that floats on the Arctic Ocean. And you see here that since, again, about 1950, you see a trend, and it's dropping quite dramatically after the year 2000 and continues to decrease. So again, we have in the scientific community a very consistent picture, just not one piece of evidence, but multiple pieces of evidence that are all internally consistent, that the Earth has been warming since the middle of last century. And in geological terms, it's actually a fairly rapid rate of warming. So then the second question we ask is, well, why is this actually occurring? Is it natural variability or not? And scientists, even 3 or 4 decades ago, when they saw the beginning of this, were suspicious because they saw carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere. Now you ask, why should they be suspicious that early on? Well, we actually know how this gas works, and we've known for 150 years. The physics was worked out in the 1850s, so this isn't really anything new. So it's actually a fairly simple system. The sun provides the energy that warms the Earth's surface. But the sun's energy mainly comes in as the light we can see, that we call visible light, or ultraviolet light. That's the sunlight that burns your skin. That's why you put sun cream on in the summertime. Those are short wavelength types of energy. But the Earth, to balance itself, has to give energy back out to space. And it does that through heat, which is longer wavelength radiation. These gases that form a belt in the lower atmosphere have very interesting properties. They let the shortwave radiation through unimpeded, the light, the ultraviolet light. But they trap the heat going out. So it makes the surface of the Earth otherwise much warmer than it would otherwise be. In fact, if you stripped away, the natural level of greenhouse gases would be 33 degrees colder. The Earth would be frozen all the time. Life wouldn't be possible. So greenhouse gases are a really good thing. But when you put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, as we've been doing over the last 200 years, particularly the last 60 to 70, the physics is really simple. The Earth has to rebalance, and it does that by becoming warmer, and that's exactly what's happening. Now let me just show you in my last slide how scientists actually test this idea. So what we do is we take a model of the Earth's atmosphere that includes natural variability, volcanoes, changes in sunlight, and so on, and greenhouse gases, and we test it. So if you look, before I put anything up here, look at the time frame, 1900 to 2000. That's actually the past. So I'm not using this model to predict anything. I'm testing the model to see if it's any good. So the first thing we asked our model is, and this is temperature going up here, and this is change in temperature from what it was before the Industrial Revolution to today. And so we said, forget about greenhouse gases, just put in changes in sunlight, changes in volcanoes, which have already happened. What should temperature do? And that's what it should do. It goes up and down if you change sunlight and change volcanoes. And that's what we should have seen from 1900 to 1950. But we know, because we've measured them, that greenhouse gases have gone up, CO2's gone up. So let's add this to the model and say, all right, now let's make it more realistic. Say, these things still happen, but greenhouse gases go up. And this is what happens. So I said, that's interesting. We can actually see a difference. The model tells us that after 1950, something should have happened. So what do scientists do then? They say, well, this is the past. We actually have observations. What actually did happen, and did the model get it right? And so the scientist comes in and says, right, that's what we observed in the black line. So again, this is very powerful evidence that we actually understand what we see, that the Earth is indeed warming. And the major cause of that warming, certainly since the middle of last century, are the additional greenhouse gases. So the physics is right, the observations is right, our models are correct to that level as well. So this really now presents a very compelling picture that we do have something unusual happening. Earth is warming, we are the ones who are driving the warming, and then we must ask the next question, well, why do we worry about this? Is this good? What risk does it pose for us, and so on? And that's the area of expertise of my colleague Leslie Hughes, and she's going to take us through. Oh, I should say one more thing before I pass it over to Leslie. And that is, why does this matter? And the reason it matters is you say, well, 1 degree. If it's 27 degrees on a summer day and it turns out to be 28, does it really matter? It feels pretty much the same. It matters because of this. It's the extremes, colds and hots that we actually feel. It's the 35 to 40 degree days in the summertime, not the 27 degree day. So if you have a climate, you have an average temperature, but you have some days that are colder and some days that are hotter. And these little shaded areas are what meteorologists call extremes. They're way out at the edge of the distribution. So if we change, and I should say that we actually organize our lives around this bell-shaped curve. This is just an example I want to use in just a minute. This is an urban transport system, and the engineers assume the climate's going to stay in that range. So what happens is we change that mean by 1 degree, say, like that, and look what happens. The extremes change much more than you would expect. for a modest increase in the mean. Now we get much more hot weather, and we get some extreme hot weather we never experienced. Well, is this theory actually true? Well, you can ask the people of Melbourne in 2009 when they hit over 46 degrees, which was unheard of, never been recorded before in Melbourne, which is an example here. And look what happened to the transport system, all right? The rails couldn't take it because the rails had not been designed for this temperature extreme. So this is what a change in climate actually means on the ground. It means that things that we're used to, things that we've engineered for, suddenly start shifting, the climate shifts past them. So we start seeing impacts, we start seeing consequences. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Leslie, who's going to bring it right down to Tamworth and to the northwest of New South Wales and talk about the risks we face here.
Hello, beautiful Tamworth. Here we are, the land of the golden guitar. Since 1950, the average temperature of New South Wales has increased by about 1 degree, and that's actually more than the global average. We know that rainfall patterns, I should say before I go on to rainfall, what we're expecting from the models that Will just talked about is that by 2050 we will get at least 1 more degree of warming, possibly more. In terms of rainfall, what we know is that we have been in a drying trend, and if we look at this map of Australia here, if you look at the green areas, they're the parts of Australia that have been getting wetter since 1950, and the brown areas are the areas that have been getting drier. And you can see that the northwest has been getting wetter, and the southwest and all down the east coast on eastern Australia has been getting drier, including this region. Rainfall is really difficult to predict in the future. It's very complex. It's far less easy to predict with any level of certainty than temperature. So about all we can say for sure is that rainfall patterns will change. For this region, there may be a shift towards more rain in winter and relatively less in summer, but that prediction is quite uncertain. So what does this mean? If climate change wasn't going to have any impacts, it would just be something for people to sit around in universities to talk about. But of course we care about climate change because of the impacts that it will have. And if we first think about the impacts in agricultural reasons, farmers are at the absolute forefront of climate change. They are in the front line because one of the really important impacts of climate change that we will most likely see is an increase in the intensity of the drought. So for every drought that we get, and we've always had droughts in Australia, if it's hotter, the impacts of those droughts will be more serious. And of course, as we get the surface of the soil drying off, it's more likely to be taken by the wind, and we get soil erosion, and especially in really vulnerable soils in this region in the Western Clay Plains, they are very vulnerable to soil erosion. Another thing that we're going to see is more frequent and more intense fires because, of course, as it gets hotter and drier, fires happen more frequently, and when they happen, they're hotter. My actual area is that I work on and have been working on for the last 20 years is the impact of climate change on species and natural ecosystems. And we can think of climate change as simply being one more stress on top of natural ecosystems that are already stressed from all sorts of things like habitat loss, like invasive species, like over-allocation of water, etc. Climate change will add to that stress. There'll be particularly vulnerable regions such as the forests up in the Liverpool Ranges and round Mount Capitar, where there are a lot of threatened plant communities already. And then, of course, there'll be impacts on particular species, and I've put the koala up there. The koala is a purely plant-eating animal. When you grow plants at elevated CO2, They do actually grow faster because CO2 acts as a fertiliser, but they actually become less nutritious. They have less nitrogen in them and therefore less protein, and they have more carbon-based compounds in them that make them less digestible. So any animal, like a koala or indeed like us, eating a plant-based diet, that plant-based diet is becoming less nutritious as CO2 goes up in the atmosphere. What I want to present here is two potential futures. The wiggly black line at the beginning of this graph shows, similar to what some of the things that Will just showed, the temperatures that we've already had, going back from 1900 till 2010. So that first part of the graph is what we've already had. And then there are two potential futures ahead of us. And one of the things that we want to talk about with you tonight is the fact that that future is in our hands. If we manage to curb our emissions of greenhouse gases very effectively, the sort of future that we face is here, this blue band, where we are trying to keep the temperatures to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial. If we don't manage to do that, the red bands show a potentially very, very different future. This is what the models are telling us our temperature will be like if we keep doing business as usual. Now, I realise that this sort of a graph seems like sort of a bit otherworldly and a bit sort of not very personal, so I want to make this personal. I'm going to make this personal firstly by putting me on this graph. Okay, I was born in the 1960s, and assuming that I lived to the ripe old age of about 85, that line there shows the average mean annual temperature that I will experience during my lifetime. Now, I have two teenage kids. They were born in the mid-1990s. If we have business as usual, that line there shows the mean and average temperature that they will experience in their lifetime. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but hopefully one day I will have them. Let's assume that my kids have kids when they're about 30 years old and they live till they're about 85. That's the mean annual temperature that my grandkids will experience during their lifetime under a business as usual scenario. But if we really control our greenhouse gas emissions, there is that other future. Hopefully, my kids and my grandkids will live out their lives in that blue portion of the graph, and that is our alternative futures. Okay, I'm going to pass this on now to Tim.
Thank you. Thanks, I realise I made a terrible mistake. I forgot to introduce our climate commissioners. So if you'll forgive me, they've partly introduced themselves, but I should just point out that Will and Leslie are two of the world's most eminent climate scientists in their own areas. Will particularly in the climate modelling and Earth systems and how they work, and Leslie in the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, on the living world that we all live in. And a fourth climate commissioner who's here this evening, who's been sitting very quietly in the corner without acknowledgement, is Jerry Houston. And Jerry was the president of BP Australasia before he recently retired, and has had 34 years of experience in the oil industry, I guess, by and large. And I was just going to ask all three of you if you wanted to share with the audience any of the reasons why you decided to join the Commission.
Well, I guess just having given that talk, that in a way explains it, is this is a really interesting policy and political problem in that science plays such a central role compared to many other policy problems that we face. So I just thought from my point of view that the science community had to get involved with this. Many of my colleagues do get involved with this, and it's important that we do. So when the opportunity came, I was happy to accept, because I thought it was really important that we spend a lot of time in our labs and in the field, but we need to get out and listen to people, give us their thoughts about the science as well as engage. So I'm tremendously enjoying this. It's a great way for scientists to really learn what a lot of people are thinking about what we do.
Yes, do you want to say something?
Well, as I said, I've been interested in climate change and its impacts for the last 20 years, particularly on Australian biodiversity, about which I am passionate. And like Will, this was just a fantastic opportunity to get out and communicate with people other than my students who, often don't listen anyway. But I think that the main reason that I'm doing this and for what I do is actually not because I'm a scientist, it's because I'm a parent, and, my kids' future is what counts.
Yeah, well, I've been working for an oil company. I've been in the sort of the spotlight on climate change for quite some time, and actually BP has been quite a progressive company in recognising the risk involved. So I've been rattling on for years, saying it's about time the scientists stood up and were counted on all of this and got off their arse and did something about it, and telling people about it. So I really couldn't back out when I was given the opportunity. So, but I have to say it is an absolute pleasure to be working beside some of these people who are real thought leaders globally on the science and making my contribution as a business person.
Thanks very much for that. Look, we do have two other commissioners who couldn't be here this evening. Susanna Elliott, who's an expert in science communication, and Roger Beale, who's one of Australia's foremost economists, but they send their apologies. There's only a couple of slides we have to cover off on here, which is just thinking a little bit about what the rising to the challenge of climate change actually means. It means we've got to shift from an economy based on burning fossil fuels to one based on new energy sources. And the only point I really want to make here is that this opens up tremendous opportunities, I think, for regional cities and the regions in general, because you are the people who are rich in sunlight, relatively inexpensive land, biomass, and many other resources that can be used to fuel the new energy economy. And I'm sure that there's lots of people in this room with a direct interest in this and are seeing things on the ground now. Perhaps we can discuss a bit later on some of the things that are happening in your area in terms of the new energy economy. Opportunities on the land are particularly important. One way we can help or assist dealing with climate change is by using living things like these trees and plants to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. I think we often misunderstand how trees grow. We think they grow from their roots somehow. They actually don't. They grow from the air. They draw carbon dioxide in through little holes in their leaves and then use the carbon dioxide to build their tissues. So trees are really congealed carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide you see in those trees was once in the atmosphere, not that long ago in the atmosphere. So if we can develop more sustainable farming that stores carbon in our soils, as well as in all of the living things on the surface of the planet, we're drawing some of the gas out of the air and putting it to work for us, which is a much better outcome. So the carbon farming initiative that I'm sure you'll hear more from in coming weeks offers a real opportunity to assist. Of course, it doesn't replace the need for action to reduce the burning of fossil fuels. We have to do that at the same time that we start sequestering carbon into the living system. Finally, wherever we go, we see the most extraordinary things. This must be about our 8th or 9th visit now to regional Australia. Wherever we go, we hear incredible stories about people and their communities doing things on the ground, whether it's community-based initiatives to buy solar panels or just improve landscapes or whatever. There's always lots of interesting things going on, and I really encourage you through the evening, if there's anything you think people should know about in your local community, we certainly would love to hear about it, and I'm sure that the commissioners would as well. So having said that, it's over to you. It's your evening. Don't be shy. I reckon you can ask any question you want. Don't worry if you think it's a bit rude or not. You just go ahead and ask. We'll be happy to answer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. And just a reminder, if you do have a question, please state your name and where you're from. And if you can keep your questions fairly succinct, and please no political statements or long statements, you'll have a chance maybe to talk to the commissioners about that sort of thing a little bit later down in the foyer. But I'd like to open it to you, the members of the Tamworth public, to question our commissioners, any question you like, and I'm sure as we've turned off our phones, they won't be able to phone any friends, and they will give you their wholehearted and expertise in the question of climate change and energy efficiency. Question over there, gentleman in the second row.
Yeah, Brian Tomlin from Hanging Rock. Just a little bit of preamble. Our economic system relies on growth for survival, and that growth is now based on increasing production of consumer, or the consumption of consumer stuff. And the measurement of that growth is gross domestic product. Production of the stuff requires energy, and that energy is supplied by fossil fuels. This means that the energy content per unit of GDP can be measured as the carbon content per unit of GDP. And does anybody, this is the question, does anybody have any idea of what percentage of carbon per unit of GDP would be required to ensure that our economic system can operate within the ecological limits imposed by the planet's natural resources and ensure we don't tip over the threshold into an unsustainable state? And would such a measure be reasonable, practical target, and could it be explained to the general population?
Tim, it's all yours.
Small question.
That's a really profound question, and it is ultimately, I guess, the biggest question facing all of humanity. You know, particularly as we enter a century where we know that the population is going to reach 9 billion or thereabouts by mid-century, and where we're seeing shortages of water, you know, food, regional at the moment, and where we're seeing, you know, impacts of human activity in terms of climate change and so forth. I don't have an easy answer to the question, but what I can say, and I might hand over to our commissioners who may have additional thoughts, but you know, what I can say is we need to decouple growth from fossil fuel use. We need to decarbonise our economy as we go forward. And we've seen significant advances over the last decade or two in that area. We've seen places like China go from being predominantly based on very inefficient use of fossil fuels through to an economy where we have, you know, they're now the world's largest producer of wind energy and of solar. So, you know, things are changing, but we have a tremendously long way to go. I might see if anyone else has any thoughts.
No, just very quickly to reiterate what Tim said, the critical phrase is we do have to decarbonise eventually. And the time frame is around mid-century or so, particularly for the industrialised countries, maybe a little bit later for developing countries so that they have the opportunity to bring their people out of poverty. But the end game is quite clear. We need to develop vibrant, very functioning economies, increase human well-being, and at the same time get fossil fuels out of the system. That's the challenge we face.
Yeah, I think we will find different ways of measuring prosperity in the future. But you know, if you're sitting in say China at the moment and they see what the Western world has, they aspire to, you know, similar sort of prosperity, and that prosperity has been built with a direct link to use of energy. And it is critical that actually we break that nexus as we go forward. And I'm sure in 50 years' time we'll be maybe measuring prosperity in a different way to the way that we do today, and achieving it in a different way to what we do today. But I think we do need to think about what we measure and what is success in the future. And maybe some of the measures that we've got today aren't the most appropriate.
Can I just make one comment, because I think that question of yours has embedded in it a certain sort of perhaps a scepticism that humanity, being so greedy and selfish, might not be able to make this transition, that we'll all just scramble after our own individual good rather than look at the common good of the planet. And I have thought about this quite a lot, because it's a central issue for everything I do. I mean, I'm about trying to help create that sustainable future. And I think, well, is there another model anywhere I know about of a greedy, selfish entity being able to self-regulate and work within a system, within a finite system? And the obvious example is our human brain. Our brain weighs 2% of our body mass in total, and yet it uses about 20% of the energy from the food that we eat. So it's greedy. It's taken far more than its fair share of the energy from the food we eat. It's also incredibly selfish. If the body is under threat, the brain will cut off resources to any part of the body before it deprives itself of one iota of any anything, whether it's oxygen or nutrients or whatever else. And yet the brain never bankrupts the body. It is integrated into a whole, this system that is the human being, in such a way that even though it's greedy and selfish, it's a great command and control system that runs the entire thing. And I wonder whether humanity's future isn't rather similar in terms of our relationship with the earth. We're greedy, selfish, upright apes living on a finite planet, and we'll always take more than our fair share of the resources. We'll always be a bit selfish about it, but is it possible we can come to an accommodation with Earth that resembles a little bit our accommodation between our brain and our body? At least that's my hope for the future.
Another question? Gentleman in the middle there? Just remember your name, please.
Professor, my name's Cole Quast. I live in Tamworth. Professor, I can completely accept the fact of carbon dioxide being bashed into the ocean. I completely agree with your theory, and I think that the ocean for years has been the pool of the surplus amount of carbon dioxide being bashed in. Evaporation, aeration, waves bashing, and carbon dioxide coming into the ocean. I can completely accept that. The problem I have with it is, I can realise that the ocean is becoming acidic. I can understand that. Now, you look at the facts there, there's figures going out from 1850, which I can't accept as being correct, because the 18th century it was 8.17. The present, the pH of the ocean is 8.069, that's 0.11. Now, the oceans are definitely becoming acidic. I can understand that. And I can understand that a lot of that acidity is being absorbed by the calcium carbonates, being corals and things like this, being gobbled up by that. I can understand that. But what I'd like to know is, you don't see much figures, recent figures, from, I'd like to see it kept yearly as to the amount of pH changes in the oceans. And I think that would be a great advantage to people to realise that it is changing, because they seem to have these big gaps of every, we say that in 2020, the pH of the ocean will be such and such. But are we allowing for the absorption of the carbonic acid eating into the calcium carbonates on the floors of the ocean and gobbling it up? Now, what happens when they're all gobbled up? I can completely accept the fact that the ocean has been the pooler of the carbon dioxide for many, many years. I completely agree with it. But I want to know, when all those calcium carbonates are absorbed, what will happen?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure of the nature of that question, but as I understand it, you're worried about the sediments at the bottom of the ocean. It's going to take a long time for that CO2 to work its way down. It's still in the surface part of the ocean. It will react when it gets down there. In fact, by the time it gets down there, it will be reacting with calcium carbonate closer to the surface as well. So we suspect that certain parts of the Southern Ocean, by about 2040, the marine organisms, the coccolithophorids, the little plankton that have calcium carbonate shells, will probably start dissolving around 2040 or 2050 if we don't start reducing emissions. So long before you have a problem down at the bottom of the ocean, you're going to have it through the water column. Because there's a lot of organisms already that have calcium carbonate shells that will be affected. So, and just to answer the other part of your question, we are measuring it year by year. There are very good statistics now and good data sets on what's happening to ocean acidity. But you're quite right, it is becoming more acidic and less basic.
Could I add something to that? We're also measuring the impact of that, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef. So since the Industrial Revolution, as you say, the oceans have become about 30% more acidic, which is at least as acidic as they've ever been in the last at least 800,000 years. We can drill into long-lived corals in the Great Barrier Reef and look at the growth rings, just like tree rings, and measure their growth rate and their calcification rate. And the latest research is showing that corals the large corals on the Great Barrier Reef have declined in their calcification rate by about 14% over the last couple of decades. So we're not only measuring it in the seawater, we're actually starting to measure the impact in the coral.
When you registered to come along this afternoon, you were also asked if you have any questions, and I've just got one of the questions here from Tim Wright. Is Tim here? Tim, your question was, today, do the people of Australia have a national directive with a belief and goal that will lead us into the 21st century? I presume it says meant that because it says 20th here, knowing that their future livelihoods will be healthy, safe and secure by adopting sound holistic principles. Is that right? Tim?
Sure. Well, look, Tim, I'm sorry. I know you were coming to Canberra for our meeting on the 24th of May, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet you there, but great to have you here this evening and have that question. I suppose that's what we're all about. You know, that's what the Climate Commission is a very small part of, is trying to build a commonality of understanding that, you know, the world is changing, no matter what we might think. It's changing physically, it's changing in terms of its economics and its mix, and that we need to take a much more holistic approach to this and work with that change. I don't believe we're there yet, and I, you know, the politics of the day reflects that. You know, people have very different views really on many aspects of the challenges that face us. Could I just say in addition to that as well that we're moving into this extraordinary new world where people are in contact with each other and exchanging ideas and even goods in a way that has never happened in the history of humanity before. So my children, for example, who are in their 20s, they have friends on the internet on almost every continent around the planet. You know, they're connected in with people. My son speaks Mandarin. He is on the internet to them all the time. So what we do as nations is still very important. But I think we're also moving into an era where there is the possibility at least of developing a global human consciousness where we understand, no matter where we live, what needs to be done. And that happens slowly and without us really even being aware of it. But there is some sort of super-organising principle, I think, at work there. I hope that helps.
Coming out of that question, Tim, John Watson has asked, how can an individual family make a difference?
Well, you know, I think that sometimes these problems seem so overwhelming that individuals feel almost helpless in the face of them, and yet we all know that we've got to work together to achieve an outcome. In some ways, that's the same sort of question as I often get. Well, what's the point of Australia doing anything? We're only small, and you know, and even if we reduced all of our emissions immediately in the Western world, nothing happen. Well, that's sort of true, but you know, what happens when a country does something, or a family does something, or an individual does something, is that people around them notice. You know, that's an act of leadership, really. Sure. So if a family do something like put on a solar hot water system on their house, if they can afford to do that, people do notice. So I just think acts of leadership are incredibly important. Everyone's capacity is different. Some people might be renting, they might be students, or you know, whatever, and they can't put a solar hot water system on, but they can change some of their light globes. They might be able to buy some green energy. They might even be able to raise the issue at their local church group or sporting group or whatever, and say, well, let's have a look at the electricity bill. We're all paying for it. Let's see if we can do something about it. You know. Sure. So I just think that those acts of leadership are really important in the community.
Any questions from the floor? Lady down here.
Rosemary Nelson, Tamworth. I don't think anyone here would probably disagree with the acknowledgement that there's a great deal of either non-understanding, denial or disinterest. And the bottom line has to be education. I've attended an excellent program here at TAFE, and you would not believe how hard it's been to have people come along. Absolutely excellent. So my question is, if we have to acknowledge education is the bottom line, if we're going to have people comply, trying in their own way, walk more, whatever it is, but just start to make people think that we're part of a global problem. And my question is, it may already be in the pipeline, but is it not possible for the sort of graph you gave us tonight, that's pretty clear, little graphs with giving basic bits of information on the radio, magazines, and newspapers, because I think we're preaching here, if not to the converted, dare I say to some of the better educated, if that's the word to use. I don't like to use that word, but you know what I mean. A lot of people are too busy to come here, and those busy people are not the people we want to aim at, so that they don't use their dryer for their clothes, etc. And if we are better understanding, we're then going to acknowledge a carbon tax, which might be called a pollution tax, and therefore might make more sense. So I think education and get to the grassroots.
Thank you.
I'm sure several of us could say something to that. Of course, we couldn't agree with you more. And in essence, that's why we're all here and why we've all decided to do this, because the Commission is about communication. That is our main role. There is a lot of confusion out there. It's not surprising. There's a lot of media personalities and politicians, dare I say, making mileage out of that confusion. We all see that. What we're here to do, and you know, in all of our regional meetings, we can only speak to a tiny fraction of the Australian population, but we're really hoping there's a sort of a ripple effect so that everybody that comes along learns something, tells their neighbour, tells their family, and that communication can ripple out through the community. You know, we've also got a website. We're producing reports. We're hoping that the links from that website people see as credible sources of information. So if you just type climate change into Google, you know, it's a way to madness. But if you go to, say, our website or the Academy of Sciences website or the CSIRO, there is lots of credible information out there written for the layperson, and that's why we're here.
And this is excellent, but I'm still getting at the mother with the husband who's not going to get on the website. And if there were some graphic, just as you've shown tonight, just a few graphic things that they get more likely to see in the papers or even on the movie or the television. Is that not possible?
Look, I think this is a really, really good point, and some of us who've actually tried to get op-eds in the newspapers or on a TV program, get some of these simple graphs up, know it has to be words. But when you look at other important aspects of our society, economics, and you go into the newspaper, there are all sorts of economics graphs. You've all seen all sorts of trend lines of what's the Aussie dollar doing, what's GDP doing, and so on. So you've got a good point. It would be great if we could convince some of our newspaper editors to just put some simple, very clear scientific graphs in the newspapers as well. So I'll take your point on board and see what we can do, because I think you've made an excellent point.
As a journalist and editor, I think if we can figure out a way that the newspapers and television can make money out of doing that, it'd be there every day, every hour. Any questions from the people in the cheap seats up the back? Yeah?
I'm Jan Bryan. I own land in the Upper Hunter Shire as well as Tamworth. Our immediate problem at the moment is we have multinationals coming in and trying to dig our agricultural land up for coal mines and coal seam gas. Now, I'm not trying to make this a political situation, but what I would like to know is does the Climate Commission have any sway with politicians of all persuasions to do something about this? Because they are trying to take our prime agricultural land and destroy it. And I would really like you people to be able to help us to do something about that.
Could I just begin by saying that it's the Climate Commission's remit is a very prescribed one, you know, which is to engage in this dialogue with the Australian public around climate issues. Now, I guess over the longer term, if we introduce, you know, we're successful seeing new technologies being fostered, that would lessen demand for fossil fuels, you know, and the sort of disruptions you're talking about. I know that's not a particularly satisfying answer, but we do have a very limited remit in what we can do. But could I just add as a personal note, so I'll take off my hat as Chief Climate Commissioner and put on my hat as Tim Flannery, and just say I've spent the last, 2 months in the last 6 months travelling up the Great Dividing Range, talking to people in rural communities, making a documentary on the state of Australia at the moment. And what you're seeing here in terms of this demand for agricultural land, for coal seam methane and coal mine development is mirrored up and down the coast. And it's often not just the fossil fuel sector. You know, there is increasing mining activity around the place. You know, I've seen it in Aboriginal communities on Cape York who want to preserve some of their environment, but where there is already rights, exploration rights being let out to people who are looking, for example, for bauxite. You know, and one of the things I've noticed again and again is everyone's in their own little silo. Very few people are talking to others about this. We find quite often there's people with a green or environmentalist view on things who are in their own little box worried about that, and then there'll be farmers who many of them hate the Greens and wouldn't talk to them, but who are worried about exactly the same thing. And then there's Aboriginal communities who aren't terribly well plugged in to either of the other two in terms of that. So I can see a situation developing where these concerns will continue to grow, and perhaps people will start coming together to express their concerns and demanding of their government that certain programs are put in place to help protect them. And again, just off the climate issue a little bit, but we were in Queensland 2 months ago. We met with the Queensland Premier and learned from her that legislation in Queensland is being considered to protect the 5% of Queensland that is the best agricultural land, to prohibit mining in that area so that the agricultural value of that land is conserved. Now, that's the sort of thing that can be done around the place in terms of trying to make sure that we have a viable agricultural sector into the long term. But in the face of that, we have to recognise that we're in the middle of this new gold rush, with all of the resource extraction that's going on. So it is a juggernaut. It's hard to control or shift. But anyway, that's my personal perspective on it.
Just a reminder that the Commission is an independent body, not set up to lobby the government or the opposition. They're here to get your views, pass them on, and just disseminate information. And I think that's what they're about. You have your members of Parliament to lobby for those sort of questions and those problems, and I'm sure they're quite willing to listen to what you have to say. I have another question that was sent in, and it comes from Ken Brown. Instead of imposing a carbon tax, why doesn't the government legislate pollution maximum levels, less bureaucracy and less cost to the consumers, he says. And Jerry may be able to answer this, but also, Jerry, before you do that, can you explain exactly what is the carbon price?
Well, the carbon price is I think someone mentioned it before, is effectively a price on pollution. So if you don't want something to happen, you put a price on it. And the objective is that you want the market to actually produce the best way of reducing it. And so you put a price on it and the market will then move. Not only will it potentially reduce consumption, but it will also do a couple of other things. Business survives on competition, and what you've done by effectively putting a price on carbon have given businesses another way to compete, because those that become the most efficient in terms of their use of energy will be the ones that win at the end of the day. So you get investments and you get competition to actually drive down the use of energy, and that's effectively what a carbon price will do. It'll lead to that additional investment. But there are various ways in which you can have a carbon price. One is a tax, but the other one is another one is the one that's just been suggested. You actually put a cap on the level of carbon that the Australian economy is going to, the Australian society is actually going to have. And that's effectively, for example, our 5% reduction is a cap. Once you put that cap on, the price will actually become an outcome. There will still be a price and there will still be a cost. And so it doesn't come cost-free, but it is a very effective way because it actually produces the outcome that you ask for. I think it is important to realise that every time that you legislate on something like this, whether it's a direct tax or whether it's a cap or whether it's new regulations to reduce pollution in some form, like in tightening up the specs on cars or things like that, it will cost you. It's just that sometimes you'll see that directly and sometimes you won't. But there is no such thing as a free ride on this in the short term. So you can't just wave a wand and the problem will go away.
Do we have any more questions from the floor, David?
David Foster, Tamworth. I didn't think we were going to get political, talk about taxes, but I'm kind of glad we are.
I did use the word price rather than tax.
Well, at the moment we've got Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, Europe and parts of the UK in a great financial crisis. And this whole situation is a thing that Australia needs to avoid being involved with. And I'm just very much afraid of the imposition of a big tax. You see, we hear very much about the inconvenient truth, but there's been a very convenient beat-up, I think, of this whole situation in the last couple of years. I'm one of the original baby boomers, born in 1945. Unfortunately, the year of one of the greatest disasters to the environment that could ever happen, and that was the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. And you know, it's the terrible polluters of the planet are the situations that are man-made, like Chernobyl, like these dreadful events that happen that go beyond anything that any person using too much petrol in their car can ever contribute to climate change. And we can't afford, well, the question is, I think, can we not avoid a tax? Shouldn't a government actively support easy access to cleaner energy resources, easy access to things like natural gas, easier access and supporting the use of things that don't burn up the environment instead of taxing us and maybe slowing us down economically as we try to grapple with our industries and our day-to-day lives with trying to survive the huge impost of yet another tax? Isn't there another way around it? Are we beating this thing up? Are we in clear and present danger if we don't do something now? And if what we do now in our homes, is that really going to stop the dreadful things that are really affecting climate change?
There's about 4 questions there, David. Yeah. I know we've got 4 commissioners, but maybe if someone can answer at least.
I hate to be the only one that kind of seems to be rocking the boat here. We all seem to be fairly comfortable with what you're saying, and I'm not all that comfortable with graphs.
That's fair enough.
I think it's a perfectly legitimate question, and I think a lot of people are asking it, and people get frightened off by, I think, the word tax and a great big tax. So what we were talking about was, you know, many ways in which you put a price on carbon, and you effectively have 2 choices, I think, or maybe a combination. But one is you actually let the market work out what is the cheapest way to actually find a solution to this, and for that you need a price in some shape or form. So that drives you down the price route. The other way is selecting, so you take a centralist approach and say, let's select the way that we do it, and someone's going to be all wise, much the way some of the centralised economies in the world have done things over the last 50 odd years, and said, let's choose the winners, let's choose the ways in which we're actually going to do it, and we'll provide direct incentives or direct mandates for them to do it. Generally, they are the least efficient way of doing things. And if you just look at the way that the free market economy generally has succeeded much more than the centrally planned economies, is because the market tends to be more efficient than selecting winners. So if you reckon there's something that needs to be done, then the conventional wisdom, certainly from the business world, would be you put a price on it and you let the market sort it out. It's not going to do everything. Obviously, where there's ways in which the market can't do it, you need to find other ways to do things, like bringing on new technology. Sometimes the price won't do that, but generally it's one of the reasons for our prosperity versus the former communist regimes. Is they went for a non-market economy, the Western world went for a market economy, and I think it's fair to say that the prosperity of the Western world is greater than theirs today.
I think there was another question there that Will may want to have a go at, Will, about whether there really is a need for action now, this year, is it?
Yeah, I'll go back to the graph that Leslie showed you. And the critical question is, what sort of world do we want our kids and grandkids to live in? There are 2 types of momentums we've got to deal with here. One is the climate system. It's like trying to turn around the Titanic. If you want to avoid that iceberg, you don't start turning the Titanic when you're 500 meters out from the iceberg. You turn it around when you're 30 or 40 kilometers out. We have to do the same thing with the climate system because of the momentum in there. We have to start getting emissions down now if we want to have any hope of meeting that 2-degree guardrail. And climate change really does get quite dicey above that. The second momentum is actually in the economic system as well. It takes time to achieve the decarbonisation we're talking about in an orderly fashion that is least disruptive to the economy and least disruptive to social systems. It takes on order of 40, 50 years to do that. And so that, when you put those two things together, if you want a world that your grandkids are going to be able to live in reasonably well, this decade we have to start turning that emission trajectory down and get it going in a downward pathway so that we can do it in a controlled, orderly, socially resilient way. So working back from where we want to go, it's actually too late if we wait for the 2020s to start doing this. It'll be prohibitively expensive and it'll be very disruptive socially, or else we're just committed to a world that our grandkids certainly wouldn't want to live in. So that's why this is indeed the critical decade.
I know it's difficult not to make statements, but if we can just keep to the questions, we can get more questions in. Gentleman over here.
Steve Warden from Tamworth. I admire what you're trying to achieve, and I think it's good that you can get to situations like this. The problem that I have when I try to get an understanding of this is that I have a situation where we now have adversarial science being thrown out from both sides. Unfortunately, on top of that, you've got politicians that now use adversarial science in this debate. My question to the Commission is how are you going to get a decent, balanced understanding out to the general public?
Look, I'll say something very quickly, Mayor, on the science side. Look, really, really good question. Your frustration is shared by scientists who also see this sort of phony science debate in the media as a real problem. I'll just say very briefly, we released the longer report, The Critical Decade, on the 23rd of May. We presented to the Prime Minister. Now, within 24 hours, the Leader of the Opposition had accepted that report, accepted the science in it explicitly. So I think we have agreement across all sides of the Australian politics that science isn't the debating point anymore. Policy is a legitimate debating point. If you go to every Academy of Science around the world, you find that they also agree with that. If you go into the scientific literature that's been quality controlled, they all agree with that. So the question that we ask as scientists is, why is particularly the Australian media or segments of it still beating up something that everybody else in the world has accepted?
Lady in the third row.
Antonia Fights from Rocky River. No one's going to like me, I don't think. You talk about consensus, Professor Stephan, but just last year, James Lovelock, who's the father of the Gaia hypothesis, said, we might all be wrong. And he said, it might not be CO2, it might be the clouds and aerosols that are driving the climate. And he said, if you go into most of the climate research units, the scientists are scared stiff because they know that their science isn't they're not too secure. And he said, finally, that we haven't worked out the physics yet. Now, he's not a redneck knuckle-dragging person. He's a very old man, he's in his 80s, and he's made it his life work to, make people live sustainably, Professor Flannery, but he admits that it's not so settled. Thank you. Would you please comment?
Yeah, look, I have a quick comment. Yeah, James Lovelock is really an iconic figure, but he hasn't been actively publishing in this field for quite a while. As a matter of fact, the last time I had some correspondence with Jim Lovelock was when the program that I was director of, international program, which was looking exactly at his sort of Gaia hypothesis, but in a far more technical scientific way. What we found was when we came at it from that direction, the mainstream climate scientists actually had it right. There was an enormous amount of evidence that supports the greenhouse effect. Jim Lovelock supports the greenhouse effect. He understands what it is, and so on. And I would strongly dispute your comment that people are scared in the climate science labs. Nothing could be further from the truth. Or it was his comment, okay, sorry. I strongly dispute Jim's comment that that's the case. I don't think he's been inside a lab for a couple of decades, and it certainly isn't the case. So I think it's a case where he's certainly an iconic science figure. He's contributed a lot, but I think on this issue, the evidence, not the belief of me or anyone else, the evidence is strongly against what he's saying. You can go into the quality control literature and check that out if you like.
Could I just add there, it's one thing for someone to have an opinion that's reported in the media, whether accurately or not, who can tell these days, and why someone says something like that, you know, we don't know. But if you want to understand what's happening in climate science, you really have to go to what's called the peer-reviewed literature. And that's where someone has taken a piece of scientific research, put it up in front of the climate scientists of the world and who have reviewed it. You know, a number of them have reviewed it and said, yes, this all adds up. It's a little bit like this, an auditor auditing a set of books and seeing that all the figures actually add up. So that's the literature that we depend on when we try to understand how the climate system works. Outside that, there's a whole lot of other literature that might include quotes from James Lovelock, it might include postings on the internet that look like they're from the most eminent journal in the world, you know, but which are actually rubbish because no one has checked that all the figures add up in them. So there's a huge amount of confusion out there, some of it deliberate, some of it, you know, fostered through misunderstanding and whatever else. But if you want to understand how the system works, you have to go back to what is the equivalent of the audited books, you know, the peer-reviewed literature, and use that as the guide. Because without that quality control, you can be reading any sort of stuff, and none of us, you know, really have the expertise to be able to delve into that and try to pick apart whether it's actually right or not. So it's a really important distinction.
Can I just add something very quickly to that, is that climate change scientists are a really peculiar bunch, speaking for Will and I here.
Thank you.
We are, I think, the only scientists in the world that wake up every day and hope that we're wrong, because the world will be a much safer place, actually, if we're all wrong. But as Tim says, the peer-reviewed literature indicates that's not the case. There was a survey done a couple of years ago by the Pew Institute in the US, where they surveyed a whole bunch of lots and lots of scientists. I can't remember how many, but there was lots that are actively publishing in the climate science literature, and 97%, 97 point something % of them said yes, the climate changes that we're seeing are due to human activity. So if you turned up, the analogy I like to use is if you turned up at the airport and there was a Qantas jet there and there were 100 Qantas engineers and 97 of them said, we actually think within a reasonable realm of probability that this plane's going to crash on its next flight, you probably wouldn't get on. And even if you did get on, if you were feeling really in a hurry, you probably wouldn't take your kids with you.
A question from up the back.
Deb Mays from Tamworth. Just commenting on the science, I'm very grateful to the contribution that the panel make towards communicating clearly what the science shows. Thank you. And here's a but. Although I think whether the science shows that we are contributing to a problem or not, when you think about the planet and the lifespan of the planet and how long we are here, our single lifespan, we perhaps should be thinking about what's an appropriate way for us to be behaving. Should we be sucking the guts out of the organism that supports our life, or is that appropriate or not? My question, though, is to Tim Flannery. I wonder if you could add a little to your comment before you were asked, what can we personally do? And I heard you say, as a family or as an individual, model that we're living in a conscious way that's respectful of our environment. I wonder, what are some practical things that we can do?
Sure. Look, I think the trouble with trying to answer that question comprehensively is that everyone's situation is a little bit different. For someone who might be a cattle farmer, for example, they might be able to do something on the broad acre, you know, like holistic management or whatever, that would have a huge impact and be tremendous. For people who are living in a suburban house, the options are different. Maybe for them, you know, if they can afford it, putting some solar panels on the roof or a solar hot water system, or even just buying green energy is an appropriate sort of option. For transport, it's about just trying to buy a car that satisfied your needs rather than your ego, you know, something that's right for the, fit for purpose, but not necessarily some huge petrol guzzler. There's so many ways we can do this, and I think that if everyone just does something that makes sense to them as an act of leadership, it really starts to have an impact. I mean, I see it when I go out to speak in schools. You find that you go out, talk to schools, kids understand this, they know their future. They'll go back and often ask their parents a question, about whatever it is. Are we really polluting? Can we do anything to reduce it, And there's often such simple things can be done. I remember when I was in South Australia, we had a campaign to get rid of the beer fridge. People didn't realise if they had a second fridge that they just kept their beer in, that was adding a huge amount to their electricity bill every year, and wasting a lot of greenhouse gases. So I really hesitate to be prescriptive about things, but there are so many practical things that can be done at every level. And it's sure they're minute. They won't they'll barely register in the atmosphere, if at all, in terms of the carbon balance. But they're all acts of leadership that help to change our society and push us in a better direction. I think Margaret Mead's words really are important there. She said something like, "Never doubt that a few good people can't change the situation. Nothing else ever has." If you remember that, I think it's inspiration.
Asking a bloke to give up his beer fridge, Tim, come on.
I know it's a big ask.
Up back over the corner there.
Hi, my name's Colin Easton. I'm from Tamworth. I've just got a bit of a question. I'm involved with a community-driven organisation called Sustainable Namoi Living. Its aim is to help the community lower its carbon footprint. Just wondering if you can give us some leads on what sort of key messages do you feel are of greatest value that need to be delivered still over the next 12 months? And, of course, what sort of sources of assistance financially do you think there are available for this sort of targeted program?
Well, look, I think one of the key messages is that we know a lot about the problem. We know the nature of the problem quite well, and I hope that what we've been discussing tonight has convinced you that we know that. But I think the really key message is we can create a much better future for our kids and grandkids in terms of the environment they live in, and at the same time keep a vibrant economy, improve our well-being, improve social systems, and so on. So that what we're not looking at is going back to the caves, like you might hear something like that. What we're looking at is the next great transition in how humans live on this planet. So there's a lot of excitement about how we can deal with this problem. New technologies, new ways of organizing our lives, and so on. But an emphasis on well-being, emphasis on this holistic approach of living with the planet, and so on. There could be and should be a really bright future. I think that's a message that hasn't got through. There's been a very negative discussion in general about doom and gloom and so on. But I think once we get over that, to say, well, we have a lot of tools. We have a lot of ways we can deal with this problem. We can leave the world as a better place for our kids and our grandkids, which is, of course, what we inherited from our grandparents. So I think we need to start focusing on that part of the narrative, which really hasn't come through very strongly yet.
Yeah, I think just adding to that, I think hopefully in a year's time we'll have the sort of the policy debate will be behind us, and as a wider community, including the business community, there'll be far more clarity in terms of going forward. And the worst thing you can do is create more and more uncertainty because there's a lack of policy direction. And so hopefully, in a year's time, you'll be able to talk with some certainty about, okay, if I do that, what is it going to cost? What are the implications going to be? How is it going to benefit? And how am I going to benefit out of making the decisions that I do? Because I think that's very important. I think we shouldn't underestimate how having the right regulatory framework in place provides the room for people and businesses to act in the same direction together.
As commissioners, I know you've only been going through this process since March, but do you have a vision already coalescing in your minds about what will happen if we do the right thing?
I guess we haven't discussed that among ourselves, but I think that in the sort of medium to long term we do. What we're talking about is a change in the energy balance that'll lead to a cleaner world and a more efficient world. So I hope, and I think all of our commissioners share this, that the sort of quality of life we enjoy will still be the same, if not better. It's just that the the energy that's powering these lights up here won't be coming from burning fossil fuels, but will come from some more sustainable source. So we'll still have all of the amenity and services. But there is the potential for some technologies to be quite transformational. So one example is electric vehicles. They offer you the potential to reroute your transport systems in quite fundamental ways, because if you're just making a tunnel for a train, for example, an electric train or electric cars, the cost of making those tunnels is only about a third as great as it is for conventional petrol-driven cars, because you've got to exhaust the waste, all the gases, and that is also, all of those gases at the surface are a great problem for communities where the tunnels are being built underneath them. So perhaps once we get into these sort of transformational changes, we will see some fundamental shifts in the way our cities operate. Perhaps more transport will go underground. Perhaps there'll be more efficient public transport as well as a result. So it's hard to look too far into the future, but I guess my aspiration rather than my vision is that this transformation will benefit humanity and the planet tremendously. It'll give us a cleaner outcome. It'll add to regional prosperity, because we'll be able to tap into energy sources that are abundant in the regions and lead perhaps to some decentralisation. That by addressing the carbon issue on farm and in national parks and so forth, we'll get a better environmental and biodiversity outcome as well. And that the world, while it may not be transformed in every way, at least I can see the potential for great improvement, as we start chasing this.
Jerry, surely it's very important that business leads the way in a lot of cases. Is that right?
Well, I think a lot of the solution is going to come from business. If you just look at a lot of the innovations that we've seen, and how dramatically the world has changed and the way we live has changed over the last 20 years, has been driven by someone having an idea and commercialising it. So I think what it's proven to me, actually, when you talk about a vision, is you can't be specific. As an ex-oil company man, I'm not as sure that other people are, for example, that electric cars are going to take over the world tomorrow. In fact, the one thing I am sure about is that the future won't be what I think it's going to be. It'll be whatever we say. If we say something definitively about the future now, then we are going to be wrong in some shape or form. But we can actually talk within sort of probabilities. So I would like to think that at the end of the day, we will be living in a world that is far more sustainable right across the board. That societies will be working far more holistically than they do today, i.e., we're not going to be pulling a lever over one side that completely frustrates trying to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, when we go back to Leslie's chart, I would hope that our grandchildren will be able to look back and say we did the right thing. I think that's very important, because they'll be judging us on the actions I think that we're going to take over the next few years.
Sure. We've got time for one more question from the floor. Gentleman down here.
Frank Henry from Tamworth. Just if the science is correct, and it seems to me like you people are suggesting that are, and there's worldwide agreement on that, it reminds me the debate on this seems to be a bit like the debate that was had on cigarettes. The naysayers are out there trying to tell a story that cigarettes aren't going to hurt people. So we're getting the story now that the climate change debate is being argued against by people that maybe have vested interests. Would it be unreasonable to suggest that they represent the greedy end of the deal?
Ooh.
Oh, wow. Look, can I just make a comment on that? I've spent 34 years in an energy company, BP, and as early as 1996, came out and said, actually, we think there's something that needs to be, we need to take action because the risk is high enough to justify business getting serious about it. Not every business did, but I think it's competitiveness and the profit motive that drive business. So, you know, if there are greedy people out there, I think that are doing this for their own ends, I think they're pretty few in number. I think that's that would be my analysis of it. I would say that most responsible businesses these days that have spent the time understanding the risks out there, because business is all about risk and reward, will come to the conclusion that you know, action is required. Now the debate then is, what is the action and who's going to wear, you know, the relative weight of that action? But you know, I would say that's where it is. But it is interesting you talk about the cigarettes, because I understand that some of the people that were behind the you know, the naysayers saying cigarette smoking doesn't do you any harm. I can say this as a former smoker. You know, those same people in the US are cropping up talking about you know, climate change being, you know, a load of rubbish. So it's quite interesting that some of those people are still around, but who's funding them? You know, I'd say it'd be very limited number of people would be doing that.
I know you probably have another 100 questions you'd like to ask, but please ask you to use your feedback forms to do that, and the questions will be answered on the Commission's website, but also, as I said, you'll have a chance to speak to the Commissioners in the foyer. But we need to wrap up, and maybe someone needs to go out and have a cigarette, I'm not sure. But if I can get Tim to give the concluding comments, please.
Well, thank you very much, John, and could I thank you all for your questions. It's great to have a diversity of questions in a venue like that. That's the way we learn. We learn from listening to other people and being respectful of their views, even if you disagree with them. Sometimes a very, very difficult thing to do, but it's great on an evening like this to see us all engage, I hope, in that enterprise. So could I just thank you? Could I thank Tony Windsor for being here for the evening as well, and ask you to thank our Climate Commissioners for their time. Thank you.